The television studio lights blazed with their usual intensity, but the atmosphere in the Good Morning America newsroom that Tuesday morning was anything but routine. What started as a standard diplomatic interview would soon escalate into one of the most talked-about media confrontations of the year, leaving viewers across America and beyond questioning everything they thought they knew about African politics and Western journalism. Welcome to Voice of Africa. In the heart of Manhattan's bustling media district, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso's youngest head of state, sat across from veteran journalist George Stephanopoulos. At just 35 years old, Traoré had already made headlines worldwide for his unconventional approach to leadership and his bold stance on African sovereignty. What viewers didn't expect was the explosive exchange that would unfold before their morning coffee had even finished brewing. The interview began routinely enough. Stephanopoulos, with his decades of experience interviewing world leaders, opened with what seemed like standard diplomatic questions about Burkina Faso's recent political developments. But Traoré, dressed in his characteristic military fatigues rather than the typical Western suit expected in such settings, had come prepared for something entirely different. Captain Traoré, Stephanopoulos began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of mainstream American journalism. Your government has been criticized by several Western nations for your recent decisions regarding foreign military presence in your country. How do you respond to these concerns? The question hung in the air for a moment, and those watching closely could see something shift in Traoré's expression. This wasn't going to be the typical diplomatic dance of carefully worded responses and political pleasantries. Mr. Stephanopoulos, Traoré replied, his voice steady but carrying an edge that immediately changed the room's energy. I think the more important question is why Western media consistently frames African self-determination as something that requires explanation or justification to Western audiences. The tension was palpable. Stephanopoulos, clearly not expecting such a direct challenge to the interview's framework, attempted to redirect. Captain, surely you understand that international cooperation requires— International cooperation? Traoré interrupted, leaning forward in his chair. Or international submission? Because from where I sit, what you call cooperation looks remarkably similar to the colonial relationships my country fought to escape. The studio audience, initially silent, began to murmur. This was not the scripted exchange they had anticipated. Social media platforms would later explode with clips of this moment, but in the studio, all attention was focused on the escalating verbal duel between the African leader and the American journalist. Stephanopoulos, his professional composure beginning to crack, pressed further. Captain Traoré, your policies have been described by some analysts as radical and destabilizing to the region. Don't you think— Described by which analysts? Traoré shot back, his voice rising slightly. The same analysts who work for think tanks funded by the very countries that have been extracting our resources for decades. The same experts who have never set foot in a Burkinabe village but somehow know what's best for our people. The exchange was becoming more heated with each passing moment. Camera operators adjusted their angles, sensing that they were capturing something significant. The show's producers, visible in the background, were making frantic gestures, unclear whether to continue or cut to commercial. Captain, Stephanopoulos continued, his tone becoming more aggressive, you're evading the question. The international community has legitimate concerns about— The international community? Traoré stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the studio floor. You mean the G7? You mean NATO? Because last I checked, Africa is part of the international community too, and we weren't consulted about these so-called legitimate concerns. What happened next would become the subject of countless news articles and social media debates. Traoré began removing his microphone, his movements deliberate and calm despite the obvious tension. I came here believing in the possibility of honest dialogue, and he said, looking directly into the camera rather than at Stephanopoulos. I came hoping to speak directly to the American people about the reality of African leadership in the 21st century. Instead, I find myself in the same colonial conversation that has been happening for generations. Stephanopoulos, now clearly flustered, attempted to regain control of the interview. Captain, if you could just— No, Traoré said firmly, placing his microphone on the desk. I will not participate in a performance designed to make African leadership appear unreasonable for refusing to accept permanent junior status in global affairs. The studio fell completely silent. Even the technical crew had stopped their usual bustling activity. This was unprecedented in the show's history. The people of Burkina Faso, like all African peoples, deserve to determine their own destiny without having to explain themselves to media outlets that have never questioned why Western military bases exist across our continent, but call it destabilizing when we ask them to leave. With that, Captain Ibrahim Traoré walked off the set, leaving behind a stunned Stephanopoulos and a television audience that had witnessed something extraordinary. The camera lingered on the empty chair for several seconds before cutting to a hastily arranged commercial break. The aftermath was immediate and intense. Social media platforms erupted with hashtags supporting Traoré's stance, while traditional media outlets scrambled to provide analysis of what many were calling a watershed moment in international journalism. Within hours, the interview clip had been viewed millions of times, with reactions pouring in from across the globe. African leaders and intellectuals praised Traoré's refusal to participate in what they characterized as a neo-colonial interview format, while Western commentators debated whether his walkout represented diplomatic immaturity or justified frustration. The incident raised fundamental questions about media representation, global power dynamics, and the nature of international dialogue in an era where African nations are increasingly asserting their independence from Western influence. For many viewers, particularly in Africa and the African diaspora, Traoré's walkout represented something much larger than a failed television interview. It symbolized a rejection of the persistent narrative that African leaders must constantly justify their decisions to Western audiences, as if sovereignty itself required external validation. The story continues to resonate, sparking conversations about media bias, cultural representation, and the evolving relationship between Africa and the West in contemporary global politics.